development of wind and solar for the purpose of carbon credit origination. But if there is some sort of a distributed generation projects which have co-benefits, I think that would be our more high quality carbon credits, because they would have SDG 7 benefits associated with it. They would have poverty alleviation and providing energy access to the masses, particularly for those who are climate vulnerable communities or economically vulnerable communities. So in that regard, I think linking it with co-benefits, additionality, and other integrity-based regulations, I think more and more high-quality carbon credits can be originated. Yes, biomass projects, they are very high in terms of this on the scale of high-quality carbon credits, because those are directly linked with the communities, particularly in rural communities. So again, following the mechanism, following the principle of achieving co-benefits with carbon credits, I think that would be more integrated with the principles of climate justice and climate finance. So the more it is closer to climate justice principle, more it is closer to the sustainable development, inclusive development, I think more high quality, high integrity carbon credit it would generate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid. Next, let me come to Zainab. If you would like to respond to any of these two questions. The first is from Fahad Salim Saab. That is, how can we improve the FNRB provided by the UN for forest cover, especially when we're looking at biomass-based cook stoves? And then there's stats which says that FNRB for Sindh is approximately 0%, while for Sindh it is 3%. Yes, if either Dr. Khalid or Zainab, if anyone would like to sort of respond to it. And secondly, later perhaps Dr. Khalid, you can also respond to the question on what role should the government of Pakistan play in helping industries comply with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So yes. So Zainab, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I think first one is about the fraction of non-renewable biomass estimates. Well, there are different kind of methodologies that exist through which you can check for the standards within those methodologies. They have been provided by the UN as well, and under CBM as well as gold standard. So it's very much important that you measure this fraction of non-renewable biomass, and it can get affected by different disasters as well, especially when you're talking about forestry. So, but if you have a lower value of FNRB, it implies that there is a more sustainable biomass use, and higher the value means that the deforestation pressure is there, as I'm mentioning, that it can be affected. So there are different methodologies through which you can assess. But before coming towards any methodology, I think one of the key areas that you need to see is how you collect your data around forestry related FNRB studies. For example, I do know that there's a methodology that exists under CDM, and within that methodology, you can check for data collection methods also on how you assess the regeneration capacity of your forest. And then there is an IPCC tier 2 and 3 approach as well that you can apply here. So I think within those methodologies, you can get a sense of how you go about it. Then you have to deploy your geospatial analysis tools like Google Earth Engine or Landsat. These are remote sensing tools that you need to apply in case of forestry, so they are able to assess how much is the cover you're assessing at this point, what is the regeneration happening within the forest, and then the land use change data is also important. Then you come for the validation. Now it's important that even for the validation, when it comes to the forestry related credits data, you apply the kind of literature review that is validated internationally, by international organizations like FAO, WWF, and even by those organizations that are implying your geospatial tools like SUPARCO. So I think, and then you engage different stakeholders, you get the certification under the particular methodology that you have applied, and then you're able to assess it. And most of the countries, even in Pakistan, what we are doing is we are applying it and assessing it under the REDD+ methodology that we have. So it depends on from which country you want to apply it and which methodology exactly you want to apply. In Pakistan's case, it's usually the REDD+ or CDM approaches that we are using. I hope I've answered your question. And Ubaid, I've skipped your second question.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Let me come to you a bit later. Okay, coming back to Dr. Khalid. Dr. Khalid, I'll combine a couple of questions. First is, again around how can the government of Pakistan help industries comply with the CBAM? But around the industries, there are a couple of questions. So firstly, the very basic one is that what exactly is the financial incentive for business and corporations to engage in carbon markets, setting aside the ethical and moral considerations? So that's basically how does it help the industries make a financial case if in case it does. And secondly, the question is that even the guidelines from the Ministry of Climate Change Environmental Coordination are there, but a lot of challenges still persist for the private sector. That is bringing additionality. That is also around like uh, the consultants are really expensive. So what exactly is the financial incentive for these industries? And the last one again links to the first one, that is the CBAM. So yeah, over
Yeah.
to you,
So,
Khalid.
Ubaid, thank you. These are very relevant questions, particularly from Pakistan's exporting industries. If there is a CBAM and Pakistani industries, they would have to pay taxes in terms of CBAM to EU authorities. They would not be export competitive. If there is a domestic market, a domestic taxation system, carbon taxation system, these industry can pay taxes domestically and can compete. But if there is an operational carbon market regime in Pakistan, in that way, I think taxation can be avoided as well. And these companies, these manufacturers, they can use the mechanism of carbon trading and generate a market and create this market-based mechanism more effective. So there is incentive on those ground as well. Secondly, I think in terms of energy efficiency and other sort of things, carbon markets do provide an economic engine for these industries to invest. Third, I think this is very relevant question for Pakistan, that the consultancy fee or the expert fee is very high, because right now in Pakistan, uh, the level of knowledge in carbon market Article 6 domain is relatively on the lower side. We need to have not only the technology transfer, but also I think information diffusion is very important. The knowledge diffusion is very important. So in this way, I think joining hand together with development partners, particularly for academia, developing standardized courses for carbon credits, Article 6, that would be very important, and keeping industry in the loop so that industry can tell what sort of mechanisms, what sort of methodologies they need so that they can generate a particular specific carbon credits for their needs as well. So for Pakistan, I think it is not just the environmental benefits, but also keeping our export competitiveness in the equation. Carbon credits and effective carbon credit market would be very essential for Pakistan, not just for the from the economic point of view, but if you want to gauge the efficiency of carbon credit or carbon policies, you'll see that you need to bring equitable development, equitable recycling of carbon revenues in the loop as well. So we need to take care of that as well. So again, from the standpoint of CBAM and other climate smart trade regulations, I think, and recently I heard this news that Republican senators, they are making a case for USA-based CBAM mechanism as well, so that they can put some sort of a tariff using these regulations as well. So if there is a tariff regime in EU based on CBAM and the USA and other countries, I think carbon markets would be very.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid. So I believe there are a lot of questions, but just for the time being, we'll perhaps move ahead. And in the meanwhile, request even the speakers and some of the colleagues, they will be responding to your questions during the discussions in the written form. So with this, we'll be moving towards the next session. So with this, let me invite back Ms. Sophia Becker for taking this forward. So Ms. Sophia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ubaid. Thank you also to Khalid and Zainab for their valuable inputs. And yes, as Ubaid mentioned, we will continue collecting all questions. And we also intend to produce a frequently asked questions document for your convenience. So please keep the questions coming in. And with that, we come to the next part of our of the session today, and it is our pleasure that we're joined by colleagues from the New Climate Institute. The New Climate Institute for Climate Policy and Global Sustainability is a non-profit organization working in climate policy and global sustainability, generating ideas on climate change and driving their implementation. And their role very much is driving implementation also in this seminar. It is indeed a pleasure for us to have Juliette Tourpé and Joshua Senna with us today, who are going to be taking you through some of the technicalities of Article 6, focusing in the first part of their input on the fundamentals of Article 6, and then moving on to the risks and opportunities, and also using case studies to show Article 6 in action. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Juliette and Joshua for their inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. We are very pleased to be here with you. We are based in Berlin, and it's great that we can do this seminar online and still be together. I also appreciate the fact that there are so many people interested. So I'm also very curious to hear the questions afterwards. We are going to have a really big presentation on the fundamentals and risks opportunities. And we will have, I think, a break after the first part to have the first round of questions, and then follow with the second part. Yeah, we can share the presentation. Okay. So I believe you can see the slides. And I will just start with an overview of the carbon markets, because we talk a lot about carbon markets, but we sometimes mean different things. And I think that was already explained by Dr. Khaled just now, that there are many different markets around, and it's important to understand the difference. Also, the difference of functions that these markets have. So the compliance market is divided into global, national, subnational markets. And this webinar is exclusively focused on Article 6 and also the VCM, but we will not talk about other compliance markets like the EU ETS or CORSIA. So there's really a lot of markets around. And on the right-hand side, you see voluntary markets, where the function is mostly to create supply for claims on the corporate side, mostly related to carbon neutrality or climate neutrality. And of course, it's no surprise to see that, to know that the compliance markets are regulated, where there's a lot of regulations and laws around, while the voluntary markets is actually non-regulated. And the last part, one of the last part of the webinar today will be dedicated to the voluntary market and what happened the last years. And because also the history is important, we will start with this, the experience with the CDM-GI, just because Article 6 is actually not new. We already had experience with carbon markets before on the regulated side and on the international side before. That's why I think it's important to hear the lessons learned from the CDM and GI. So you might know that in the Kyoto Protocol, there were 3 market mechanisms. There was the international emission tradings. Sorry that the currency is not working. I'm just gonna put everything at once. So on the international emissions trading side, the currency was assigned amount units, and how it worked, and it was actually only for countries who had targets, or these Annex 1 countries. and they basically could share and trade international emissions trading units. And the climate impact of those were really depending on the cap. So I think this is one of the fundamental of carbon markets. It's looking at the units. The additionality is really important, but also looking at the cap of the country is also very important. Is that if you have a country with a very weak cap, there is a risk that this country could sell what we call hot air on the market, which means that this country would sell emissions reduction that are actually not real because they are sold from a cap which is overestimated. And on the international emissions trading of the Kyoto Protocol, the climate impact was really related to whether the cap was stringent or not. For instance, countries like Russia and Ukraine had a very loose cap and sold a lot of hot air on the market. And why is this problematic? Is that other markets, other countries bought these emissions reductions instead of reducing themselves. So if you sell or buy hot air on the market, this actually does not lead to overall emissions reductions. The second column is dedicated to the clean development mechanism, and I think Pakistan had experience with this, as we just heard. So the currency was a certified emissions reductions, and this is a project-based mechanism, meaning that a country or a project proponent implements projects in another country. And here, historically, and that was the function of the CDM, is that a country from the global north would account emissions reductions from a CDM project based in the global south. And here again,
It's Juliet, sorry to interrupt. Can we try going to full screen mode, please, with the slide?
Oh, sorry. I see that in a full screen mode. That's why I didn't know there was a problem. Sorry about that. We'll just try to fix that. Ich glaube, das ist, weil wir jetzt bei Bildschirm haben.
Can you still not see it?
No, it's the same one. I mean, it's showing two screens. One is the main screen and then the next slide screen as well.
Ah, that's annoying.
So what you have to do is firstly go to the full screen mode and then share that screen.
No.
Yes, it looks fine now. Can you kind of try moving the slides?
Yes.
Yes, it's working perfectly now.
Okay. Sorry about that. We didn't see that there was a problem. Okay. Yeah, I was talking about the climate impact of CDM projects, and here the climate impact is very much related to additionality. Why is it not related to the hot air problematic that I just explained? Is that, as you know, in the Kyoto Protocol, the world was divided in two. Developing countries didn't have a target, while industrialized countries had one target. It means that there was no problematic relating to hot air because only industrialized countries had these targets and were trading among themselves. And the last category is joint implementation, and Article 6 has a lot in common with joint implementation. The currency were emissions reduction units. It was also a project-based mechanism. But this was exclusively for countries in the global north. So it was for instance, a German project proponent investing in a Russian project. And here it was the climate impact was very much related or dependent on whether the country has a stringent cap and whether a project is additional. So I am not going to go into this slide much because I think Dr. Khalid has explained it all, but these are the quality criteria that a carbon credit unit has to have. They have to be real, they have to be additional, they have to be measurable and verified, they have to be permanent, avoid leakage, follow the do no harm principles, and also counted only once. These are all the quality criteria that credits have to have. And as you might know, we've had a lot of reputation risks related to projects that have been proven non-additional. I think the additionality criteria is the most difficult one because you have to basically prove that the projects would not have been implemented without the revenues related to the carbon credits. And this is something very difficult to prove because you have to compare with a situation that do not exist. The real criteria is also very challenging, especially for forest projects. I will explain this later. But these 7 criteria have to be followed systematically in order to have a good outcome. And you cannot just say it's real, but it's not additional. This also doesn't work, or the opposite. And why it's important, and I think that's also very important to know, is that at best, offsetting or using a carbon credit on the compliance carbon markets and accounting this for your own emissions is at best a zero-sum game. It is not reducing emissions overall. It is at best a zero-sum game, and at best means you have to follow all these quality criteria I just said to follow that principles. And here are 2 examples. If you have if you offset 1 ton of CO2 with an additional project, this results in 0 ton of CO2. This is a zero-sum game, and this means that a country has offset its emission, but this does not lead to any reductions in emissions globally. And then you have the second case where you have 1 ton of CO2, but you offset this through a non-additional project, meaning a project that would have been implemented anyway. This actually leads to plus 1 ton CO2, which means a global emissions increase. In that case, this means that company or country has not reduced or offset its emission, and there is a global increase in emissions. And to set the scenes, I want to start with these slides summarizing the findings of 3 meta-studies on how carbon markets have done so far, and the results is really poor. As you can see, there was a report commissioned by the EU Commission published in 2016 on the CDM, which came to the conclusion that 85% of the projects and 73% of the credits have a low likelihood that emissions reductions are additional and are not overestimated. This means that if the CDM was used in compliance carbon markets, like in the EU ETS, this has led to a global emissions increase. The second example is a study analyzing systematically GI, joint implementation, which came to the conclusion that 75% of the credits are unlikely to represent additional emission reductions. and about 95% of the total units were from countries with significant AAU surplus, meaning hot air. This is the problematic I explained before. And these were mostly from Russia and Ukraine. So here again, the GI has led to global emissions increase. And then the last meta study was published during the COP last year. And this is one analyzing not only compliance system like CDM projects, but also a lot of projects on the VCM. And here the results are that less than 16% of the carbon credits issued to the investigated projects constitute real emissions reduction. So we have actually 3 meta studies, very serious scientific studies, coming to the same conclusions that ex post evaluation underlines a very, very poor integrity overall. This means that for Article 6 to deliver, it needs to have a really different strategy than what we had before. Now I'll give word to Joshua for key terminology. This is important to understand the rest of the presentation on Article 6.
Thank you very much, Juliette. And I wanted to say thank you again for having us here and for the very nice first part of the presentation by Mr. Dr. Khalid. And we will switch in between the presentation through the different parts. And I will go through the key terminology now and to have a bit of basic understanding and to have a couple of basic requirements explained. And the first term we also have heard earlier before is ITMOs. Those are the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And to just briefly explain this again, those are the emissions reductions or removals that are then in the end being traded. And this happens in a way that an emissions reduction, which is happening in a country, becomes a mitigation outcome that stands for the M and the O in ITMOs. And this mitigation outcome can then in the end be traded. And one ITMO refers to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So in the end, one ITMO can be transferred from one country to another one. And this ITMO, as we already have heard before, must be real, verified, and additional, and come from a project after 2021. And another very important thing to understand is the mechanism behind transferring those ITMOs, and it's called corresponding adjustment. And on the left side of the slide, you can see an overview for the host countries. Those are the countries selling ITMOs and producing the emissions reductions. And on the right-hand side, you can see the emissions balance for an acquiring country, so a buyer country, typically from the global north. And on the very first column of the emissions reduction of the emissions balance, you can see the greenhouse gas inventory before any mitigation activity. And then in the second column, you see a country is reducing emissions, so producing emissions reductions. And you can see those 2 arrows. The first one is the domestic emissions reduction, so what is happening in the country anyways, and they are doing for their own NDC. And then below you see the other part, which are mitigation outcomes, so the emissions reductions registered at mitigation outcomes under Article 6 to then be able to be transferred to other countries. So you can see in the center column that the actual emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in the inventory are low, and the green line you can see that is the NDC target of a country. And the corresponding adjustment mechanism says that all those ITMOs that you are transferring from a country to another country, you then have to add back to the emissions balance. So you cannot use them for your own emissions balance in the country. So all the ITMOs, Pakistan, for example, is selling to other countries and transferring to other countries. It cannot use in their own emissions balance. So you have to add them back up, even though you have reduced those emissions. for the years that you are selling the ITMOS for. And that means in the end, you come up at a level in the inventory which is different from the actual one, but it is taking into account the ITMOS that you sold. And the other way around, it happens for the buyer countries, for the acquiring countries, and you can see the emissions balance on the right-hand side, that they are reducing their emissions domestically, but not far enough to reach their own NDC. And in the end, what they do is then buy those ITMOS to reach their NDC target, because they are not doing it on their own in their own country domestically. So you can see in the center column again that the actual greenhouse gas emissions in the inventory are too high for the NDC, but then the country buys the ITMOS from the other side, from the other country, and through this it reaches its NDC target, and the greenhouse gas inventory will be shown lower in its emissions balance officially, even though the actual emissions in the countries are higher. So I think this is a very important thing to understand, that always ITMOS, so emissions reductions that are produced in a country, are then being accounted for in the emissions balance of other countries after they're being transferred. Then two other also very important terms. This is the OMGE, the overall mitigation of global emissions. So the goal of Article 6 is to overall, of course, increase ambition and also reduce emissions further. And therefore, under Article 6.4, it is mandatory. There are two mechanisms. First, the OMGE, which gives 2% of the transferred mitigation outcome towards an overall mitigation in global ambitions. So 2% of the whole amount of ITMOS that are being transferred to the other country are in the end not being transferred, but are being cancelled, so that this is a support for global emissions reductions. And then we have a second part, which is also mandatory under 6.5, the SOP, the share of proceeds, which is usually 5%, and also mandatory under Article 6.4. And this is an automatic transfer of the issued volume that goes directly to an adaptation fund. So in the end, 7% of ITMOS being transferred under Article 6.4 or of the emissions reductions cannot be accounted by the buyer country, but go somewhere else. And here we can see an overview of the different type of credits. We have those two main mechanisms under Article 6, which is Article 6.2, the bilateral agreements, so where you are transferring ITMOS in between two countries usually, and as you can see on the bottom, this is possible in different cases. Usually, as I said, under the NDCs, under bilateral agreements between two countries, but also it is possible to use it under CORSIA or also other purposes. And on the right side, you see Article 6.4, where the emissions reductions are actually called Article 6.4 emissions reductions. And they are, if authorized, they need a corresponding adjustment, as explained before. And once they are transferred, they also become ITMOS. And there's one special case where they can also be non-authorized, and in the end become mitigation contribution units, where they are then not accounted by a different country. And the last important terminology we have is the sharing of mitigation outcomes. So that is something we will also go into depth a bit later. But you can see that a mitigation outcome has, or a project does have a whole amount of impact. That is the bottom line. So, for example, a project gives out a couple of emissions reductions, but only some of those are then in the end being registered at mitigation outcomes. And again, only a part of this can then be transferred. So it doesn't mean that one project which is being implemented needs to sell or transfer the full amount of mitigation outcomes that are being produced through this project. And that shows that a country that has many projects, for example, can use some of the mitigation outcomes also for their own NDC, and a country can look a bit how many of the ITMOs it transfers in the end, and if it can or must use some for their own NDC to, in the end, also be able to reach its own NDC. Exactly. Then we come to the third part, and I'll hand over to Juliette again.
Thank you. So this is, we are now going into more details of 6.2 and 6.4. And to set the scenes, I just want to summarize the 9 years of negotiation that we have had on Article 6. So this was a very difficult birth, I would say. It first appears in the Paris Agreement, obviously, in 2015, but it's actually only operational starting in December 2024. The reasons for this is that the negotiators actually could not really agree on what Article 6 should be and how stringent it should be made. There were probably mostly two sides. Some sides wanted loose rules, a lot of space to do whatever they want, and there was another side which said, no, we really need stringent accounting rules. All ITMOs have to be accounted somewhere, no double counting, etc. So 21 is the completion of the rulebook with Article 6 standing, but still after that there was a lot of questions being unanswered, and they have been answered eventually in 22 and 24. COP28 in Dubai also did not come with a positive results. I think this is important to say that this is really a very difficult dossier within international negotiations, and I don't think that's going to be different going forward. So we have now rules, but they also will be reviewed in 28, and I expect another set of difficult discussions. So we have 9 paragraphs in the Paris Agreement on Article 6. We have 6.1, which is basically the goal, the headline goal, and these are also very important. The goals are to pursue voluntary cooperation, to raise ambition, and promote sustainable development. And I think this raising ambition is a crucial element of Article 6. Then we have 6.2 and 3, which basically sets out the framework for authorization and international transfer of mitigation outcomes with robust accounting, as it says. Then we have the new mechanism on the 6.4 and 6.5 under UNFCCC oversight. That is basically what differentiates it from 6.2. 6.6, just as my colleague just explained, the share of proceeds going to the adaptation fund. And then we have a framework for non-market approach under Article 6.8. And this leaves us with mostly 3 main components. 6.2 is a framework for international transfer mitigation outcomes with limited UNFCCC oversight. 6.4 is a new crediting mechanism called PECAM, so it's a Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. And then we have 6.8, which we actually will not really cover today, because this is a non-market instrument. It promotes mitigation adaptation through finance, tech transfer, capacity building. So this is typical climate finance, and 2 countries agreeing on a certain type of cooperation. Now going into 6.2. So as my colleague just said, it allows countries to authorize ITMOs for 3 possible use. We expect that the most frequent uses will be used towards an NDC, so 2 countries trading ITMOs and 1 accounting for these carbon credits in its own inventory. And then the second is the use for international mitigation purposes other than achievement of an NDC. And this is the case used for CORSIA, so civil aviation under CORSIA also have targets and mitigation targets, and they are based on the carbon market. Application of corresponding adjustment is mandatory. That's always the case if you want to trade mitigation outcomes. There is no carryover of ITMOs between NDC periods, so I think that's also a very serious limited factor. And as we just heard, mitigation, the overall mitigation of global emissions and share of proceeds is only voluntary for 6.2. But most importantly, there is a very, very broad room for maneuver and scope for confidentiality. Some people call 6.2 Wild West. There is limited international oversight, high reliance on weak existing standards coming from the VCM, which have not proven that they can lead to quality. There is basically no agreed rules on additionality, quantification, permanence, accountability, equity. So all the things that I started to introduce at the beginning. And there is also no consequence for non-compliance. For instance, Guyana authorized the issuance of forestry-based carbon credits under the R3 standard. Although they are not additional, but there is no country or no system to stop the country from doing this. The only things on non-compliance is you can address inconsistency. So the technical expert review can address inconsistency. And there were in May, the first reviews from the technical expert team were published. And also a new tagging approach for ITMOs under the review process. You can basically say there was no inconsistency identified. There were some inconsistency identified. And then the third is information for check is not available. And there is a very loose recommendation in case of inconsistencies, including requesting that ITMOs are identified as inconsistent, not be used. But again, this is really depending on the country. The countries still want to use these ITMOs that are non-inconsistent with the rules. They can do it. There is no process to stop them from. The first technical expert reviews were published in May 25, and it resulted in rather critical assessment. Switzerland, for instance, it says that had not clearly articulated how its cooperative approach contributes to the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, which is a basic, the fundamental element, I would say. And Ghana, the same, asked Ghana to clarify how its activities contribute to the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and ensure that there is no net increase in global emissions. So some things can be raised by the technical expert reviews, but again, if countries go forward and ignore them, there is no way to stop them. What we have seen the last years is a lot of bilateral agreements already starting between buyers and sellers. So you see the list of sellers is very big. And the existing bilateral agreements provide little insight, unfortunately, into the impact that the transfer of mitigation outcomes might have on their indices. Now, this was explained by my colleague before. If you sell ITMOs, you give up the right to account for them in your own inventory, meaning the gap in your inventory, and this would mean that you are aware of this and you have a plan to replace this through other mitigation options. but it seems that it is not always the case. And then questionable buyers, because buyers do not have, very often do not have a sufficiently ambitious NDC to ensure that the transfer of mitigation outcomes leads to higher ambition, which is the highest principle under 6.1. Now I go to 6.4, the PECAM, the new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So it covers most activities at different scales. As we said before, there is 2 types of currencies, authorized credits and non-authorized units. 2% OMGE and 5% share of proceeds was explained before. And I think that's also very important, that under Article 6.4, all CDM projects can transition to the mechanism. They must have been requested to transition by the end of 23, and the transition needs to be concluded this year. So starting next year, we will have more clarity on how many that is, but we made an assessment 2 years ago, and we expect about 1 billion CDM credits transitioning to 6.4, which raise a big question in terms of integrity, because as explained before, most of these credits, a very high share of these credits, were not additional. So the big difference between 6.2 and 6.4 is that 6.4 has a pretty strict UNFCCC oversight with the 6.4 supervisory body, which has 12 members nominated by country. So it's mostly a political process, but these people are carbon market experts. And what the supervisory board does is it approves project and methodology. It defines quality criteria. So we already have standards on methodologies, removals, additionality, baseline, and leakage, and further methodology, further standards will follow. And it also ensures safeguards and resolves grievance. So all these three different components differentiate 6.4 very strongly from 6.2, because as you can see, very defined international criteria were adopted for 6.4. Here again, we see that a lot of countries have started to be active. You need a prior consideration notification under this Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. The pioneer country is India, which has half of the activities planned, and 3/4 in Asia. Pakistan is also a country which has gone forward already, and the big focus is energy. So 350 projects are registered as renewable energy projects. On open issues, still have to be resolved on the 6.4. We have in May 25, we had, I just said, additional baseline and leakage, and the next steps are approval of new methodologies. So this should start actually soon, because without a methodology, you cannot develop a project. So the methodologies still have to be approved by the supervisory board. And then non-permanence and large-scale crediting programs, and also the registry must be approved. So these are the big steps expected this year, and we expect new methodologies next year. This is just an overview again of everything I said, summarizing the difference between 6.2 and 6.4 for you to remember. So limited oversight for 6.2, very broad international oversight for 6.4 through supervisory body. Integrity of ITMOs, we think that is not ensured under 6.2 because countries can do whatever they want. On the 6.4, much higher bar on quality, but we see a risk with these millions of credits from the CDM transitioning to 6.4. Existing projects already exist on the 6.2, but this is not the case for 6.4. As I just said, transparency is not required into 6.2. There is a very high transparency under 6.4. Double claiming, same mechanism for both. And also 6.2, under 6.2, OMGE and SOP are voluntary, but they are required for 6.4. I will pause now for questions eventually. I don't know if I didn't follow the chat for sure.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and Joshua, for this very detailed overview. I think one of the first, most obvious question that I would like to pose on behalf of our participants is that I, as a private sector company, why do I need to know about these broader policy issues surrounding 6.2, 6.4, and also why is it important for me to know the key terminologies? How does that impact me and the projects that I'd like to create? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is the very good question. I think as a private sector, it's very important to understand the broad picture around Article 6 in order to get involved. And I think the most important element is understanding corresponding adjustment and the impact they can have on the NDC of your country. Because as private sector, you might be interested to work to develop a project and to sell it on the international markets. But at some point, you will have to register your project in the international authorities, and you will need to apply corresponding adjustment. And Pakistan might not authorize corresponding adjustment for sectors that Pakistan want to account in its NDCs. So the first step for Pakistan, and I think the country is doing this now, is really to develop a framework and to identify the sectors that could rely on international carbon finance, and to be very aware that these the associated emissions reduction will be sold away and that you cannot account for them. And if I were Pakistan, I would identify high-hanging fruit only and sell them on the international markets. Basically, only selling high-hanging fruits mean expensive emissions reductions that Pakistan is not planning to do itself. And I think as private sector, you can very much contribute to identifying what these high-hanging fruits are, because I am sure you know in your sectors what are the cheap reductions and what are the expensive reductions. And you can start a dialogue with the government saying, look, these emissions reductions cost $200 a ton. We are not able to do that. Can we sell these on the international carbon markets? And the government can then go and try to find a buyer for this, because they are, of course, very expensive. But I don't know if you followed the debate in Europe last week. The EU just announced that they will buy Article 6 credits, and they will only buy 6.4, and they want to have very high quality 6.4 credits. So this is somewhere where Pakistan and the EU could meet and ensure high quality supply and demand.
Yes, thank you so much. So yeah, just to perhaps we'll combine a couple of more questions that we have received. One is really around the social and environmental protections of any projects that's coming in. So the question is basically that well, we fully agree that these carbon markets can actually open up very number of opportunities for financial and global collaborations. However, it's really important to build safeguards from the outside. For example, if we prioritize participation without addressing issues like fair pricing, long-term obligations, and social safeguards, there might be some risks that selling credits at undervalued prices communities could face actually some of the unintended consequences if these projects aren't designed without any robust social environmental protections in the long term. So if you have any particular thoughts on this one?
I mean, I think we could do a whole webinar just on that question. I think it's a very relevant question and it's a very challenging question. In the past, again, I only summarized the lessons learned from the CDM, GI, and VCM in terms of environmental integrity, but in terms of social integrity, it looks also quite bad. And why is that? Is that some standards put the consultation aspect somewhere in the standard, but this is not applied correctly, or consultation take place but not with the right people, or consultation take place but not in the local language. So there's actually so many problems related to consultation. And 2 weeks ago we were in Bonn and we had a side event, the civil society, with civil society representatives from countries like Kenya saying that their land was now dedicated to carbon markets and they didn't even know. So their land had actually been sold already and there was no consultation. And if you look at the authorization, everything has been done according to the standard, but the local community actually didn't know what's going on. So there's a lot of examples like this. And again, I think here 6.4 is much stronger than 6.2, but these consultations are always a very, very tricky step in every car markets you do, because you need to really make sure everybody is aware, and that costs money and that costs time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that really addresses the key questions. If you have any, Ms. Hera, Fatma, if you have any follow-up to this, please do let us know. Moving the discussion a bit towards the next end, there's also a couple of questions that more on the institutional framework side. Like, for instance, if you're looking at the monitoring and verifying carbon market transactions under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, what is the role of currently the local governments and particularly the environmental protection agencies? And this is again a question that is coming in on the behalf of the colleagues from the one of the environmental protection agencies. So, I mean, just to again, and won't be talking particularly in the context of Pakistan, but in generally, what is the overall role of these local governments, if there is any in the overall transactions that happen under the Article 6?
Yeah, again, I think so. In the developing this training, we explicitly excluded those questions because these are very, very technical questions. And again, I think it would be good to have a follow-up webinar just on that, also informing the private sector what the steps are, because it's very related to each country and it's also it's moving a lot. It's very dynamic in most countries. And I think we would have to look at the institutional arrangements of Pakistan, which we haven't done here. But I think these are all very relevant questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. I believe if there are any other questions, particularly regarding the Article 6 and the initially terminologies that we have actually discussed, the further guidance and the steps that we have actually discussed, so please feel free to drop them in the chat box. And from there, I believe as of now, we can move further. So yes, back to you, Ms. Sophia and NCIT.
Okay, I guess then we'll continue from now with the second part. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Then I'll come to the chapter on risks and opportunities of Article 6. Because as we already have mentioned a couple of times, one of the most important terms here is ambition and the increasing ambition through Article 6, because that is one of the main goals. But the question is, what can Article 6 realistically contribute to fill the ambition gap that we're having? You can see here that is one of our projections from our institute. The black line is the historical current emissions, and we're around 53 gigatons of CO2 equivalents at the current level. And you see the gap. The green line is the 1.5 scenario. So in 2030, we have a very big gap in between the targets and where we are currently actually heading, of around 19 to 23 gigatons. So almost half of the emissions where we currently are. We would need to reduce to actually fight climate change and come back to a pathway which aligns with the 1.5 target that we're having. And now the question is what we earlier said. We start with Article 6, but then in the end, is it just a zero-sum game, or do we actually increase ambition through Article 6 transactions? So we really need to take care of closing this ambition gap, and therefore we do need to increase our ambition, and we need to take care that the mechanisms that we implement are doing this. So, and for Article 6, we especially have to take care of many requirements, and even then, what we said, it might just be a zero-sum game. So we have to take care that we do not just stay on the same level or increase ambitions, but actually reduce ambitions in the couple of next years. And so we can see that many countries are interested in participating in Article 6. And you can see that currently there are 78% of the countries under the UNFCCC that are interested to participate in Article 6. And here you can see the cooperative approaches, which is Article 6.2. So usually the direct bilateral agreements we find in between countries, and under mechanisms that is Article 6.4. So there's also 1/3 of countries that are interested in participating. And you can see overall the intention to participate in Article 6 is increasing. So now we're trying to put this together, that we have more countries that want to participate in Article 6, and with the target of increasing ambition. So we have to find a way of putting this together. And it is not only ambition, which is one of the main principles, so how Article 6 leads to higher ambition, but we also have two other important points, which are equity and quality. So on equity, it is also the question if the use of Article 6 actually respects equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So do we see that, or we see that in the past, many countries from the global north have emitted much more emissions than other countries. So do we now see that the countries from the global north are also fulfilling their duty to take care of more of this ambition, and that there is a fair process overall? And the third part is the quality term, that we have the questions if mitigation outcomes are actually real, measurable, additional, verified, permanent, avoiding leakage, not double counted, and contributing to sustainable development. So I think that is also very important and very relevant also for the audience here, for the private sector, that we in the end have carbon credits being produced that fulfill all these criteria, because otherwise we do not see any increase in ambition, or we not even stay in the same amount, but we are reducing ambition by Article 6. So we definitely need to take care of the quality issue here as well. And then we're looking at the state side, the government's sector, that needs to address a number of conditions to then, in the end, successfully use Article 6.2. And Those are all things that countries are now that Article 6 is beginning need to take care of and need to establish in the upcoming years. So that is also relevant for Pakistan. We have heard earlier that the first strategies and guidelines are already being developed and have been developed. So it is very important that the countries not just develop those guidelines, but then start implementing and having very strong domestic arrangements in place to then be careful or take care of the qualities and also of the whole registering process and to authorize the transfers. And there are many different things which need to be taken care of. And then the second part, what we have shown earlier in the graph, is to apply corresponding adjustment. That is also a very important task which needs to be fulfilled by the government, because it is extremely important to avoid double counting in the end. So you need to have robust registries which exactly show the emissions that have been reduced and the amount that is being transferred, and that we do not see emission reductions being used under different scenarios and also under different emissions balances. And exactly what I said before already, then you need to develop domestic registries to track those ITMOs and to monitor what is happening, how is the country doing, what is the progress over time, and yeah, then prepare and implement a strategy for participation to identify where finance is needed. So I think that has already happened also in the guidelines, which have been explained earlier, that Pakistan needs to check in which sectors climate finance or carbon finance is especially needed, and where it makes sense to also make a use of it. Then we see that cooperation activities should meet a number of key criteria to serve as an ambition-raising tool. So we first see that ITMOs need to reflect very high environmental integrity, and that is something we've mentioned before. All the qualities, all the quality issue, it needs to fulfill all the criteria to then support critical development, especially of technologies which we do not currently see in the country. So Article 6 tries to go into this sector of technologies which are really inaccessible for companies in the country. And that is what we need a strategy for those sectors. And this is where it conflicts with the CDM, because the CDM is still using older activities and older methodologies. Then another important point is to have low transaction costs. We think it is important that all the money which flows through Article 6 in the end needs to get to the countries and into the projects. But there are many intermediaries on the way. So we often see that Article 6 brings very high transaction costs, and those need to be taken care of. That the administrative costs don't get too high. And then another very important point is that we need ambitious domestic targets in both countries. So Article 6 should not be that a country is able to reduce its domestic amount of emissions reductions, but it should increase always the domestic climate action it is doing, and then it can also participate under Article 6. But first, it is always very important that domestically a country is active. And then we have the last part of high levels of OMGE and SOPs. The 2 points we talked about earlier, the 5% and the 2%. That is already a small amount, but as we said under Article 6.2, for example, this is not mandatory. So it would still be good to there use those percentages or even use higher percentages to actually have an impact on overall mitigation of emissions. Then for the same categories, we have a couple of problems and failures to actually meet those conditions. And there we have the issue of low quality ITMOs that a seller country may need to deliver more challenging mitigation to achieve the same target. And this is because we sometimes see an overcrediting of projects. So in the end, this is what needs to be avoided, because otherwise, when the calculated amount of mitigation outcomes is higher than the actual reduction effect of the activity, then we have a problem, because then we have a mistake in the emissions balance. Then it seems that we are actually reducing emissions, but we are not doing it. So on paper, it looks like we're doing well, but climate is still changing, and we still have a problem with too high actual emissions. Then, as I said, we sometimes have high transaction costs, and therefore we need to establish domestic laws and authorization procedures. They can be an administrative burden this way. And Article 6 activities can divert critical resources from alternative roles to promote decarbonization. And to come to a point of weak domestic targets, buyers should not substitute domestic mitigation by procuring ITMOs and offsetting their emissions. And sellers may have a incentive to weaken their targets to make it easier to sell ITMOs then. So as I said earlier, it is important that the overall ambition is high, and that countries are not reducing their domestic ambition just to sell mitigation outcomes under Article 6. And yeah, the last point with the overall mitigation, that we have the percentages that we need to take care of and otherwise we see a failure in to support adaptation needs for vulnerable countries. And to go against this, we can look at a couple of specific risk strategies by countries. First and foremost, it's very important to have benefit sharing agreements. So this speaks about the bilateral agreements under Article 6.2 in between two countries. And a thing that can be implemented is credit sharing. It's also a slide we had earlier before, that mitigation and mitigation outcome or project is being implemented and being financed through Article 6, but not the whole amount of mitigation outcomes produced under this project are then being transferred. So we want that you have a sharing of those credits which are being produced under a project, and for example, some part of it can stay in the country and is being used for the national target of Pakistan, for example, and another part of the project is then being transferred to another country, another part of emissions reductions. But that we try that the whole project is being financed through Article 6, but in the end, not all the credits are just being transferred, but some of them stay in the country. That is one opportunity. Another one is to have shorter ITMO periods, but that goes into the same direction. And then another interesting point is to have fees. And that is also something Dr. Khalid mentioned earlier, that Pakistan is also planning to have an administrative fee on ITMO transfers, and that is to account for the administrative costs which are occurring, and to pass, in the best case, the fee on to the buyer, so that for the project developers, it's not them who pay the fees, but as a top up for the buyer country. And a fee can not only be done for administrative reasons, but could also be an extra fee to have an extra carbon income for a national adaptation fund, for example. And you could say that you use a fee to then earmark specific or to earmark the specific income to then put this into reinvestments in the country, which also produce further emissions reductions and have a further positive climate impact. And a last idea also to work against those risks is to put a cap on the amount of credits which is being transferred, that a country mitigates the risks of overselling its amount of credits. So now I hand over to Juliette again for the specific risks in forestry and land projects.
Thank you. So this, I'm starting with a slide which describes the high reputation risks that these projects have. You probably saw the media coverage on the voluntary car markets the last 2 to 3 years. It was mostly associated with scandals, and mostly these concerned forest projects and land projects, mostly red projects. So there was actually a lot of newspaper articles in the Financial Times, in New York Times, in the Guardian, etc., and really showing that there is a problem with these projects, and that these projects actually generate credits that do not actually reflect real emissions reductions. And to summarize, there's a few typical challenges associated with these red forestry projects. As I just said, the real is very important and very challenging. There is a real risk of inflated baselines leading to carbon credits that do not represent real emissions reductions. Then there is always the challenge that these projects are very difficult to measure and verify, or the emissions reduction coming from these projects. The permanence is always a problem as well, because there is a risk of reversal due to natural phenomena in most cases. Leakage is also a challenge because it's very difficult to prove that your project preventing deforestation does not lead to another project leading to deforestation in the area or in another country. And do not harm principle, that's what we said before. There is also a real problem with safeguards for the community, often missing. So these are the most important risks. And if you look at projects being generated, being done on the voluntary carbon markets in the forest and land project, it's mostly avoided deforestation project, reforestation project, afforestation project. There's also a project related to improved forest management, but these are mostly in North America. And to come back to these overcrediting risks, I think this is really the most important aspect of a REDD project, and this is the most important thing to get right, to avoid unreal emissions reductions on the market or hot air. And overcrediting occurs when developers claim more reductions than they actually achieve, and this can be easily done setting a false baseline. So if in all projects, one of the most important exercises is to set a baseline, which is the basis for comparing an actual case without the project with another case with the projects. And in the cases of deforestation projects, we can easily set a wrong baseline, assuming that high deforestation rates would take place if you don't implement the project. And this leads to a lot of credits being generated, which are actually not real. And research shows that the most common methodologies for REDD+ project, there is a very broad flexibility for project developers to set the baseline, and that there is a lot of overcrediting going on in these projects. And this is a real problem because these projects represent a pretty high share of credits being generated in the VCM right now, and we do not want to import that problem into Article 6. This is just an example of a Kasigao Corridor REDD+ VCM project in Kenya. It was one of the most celebrated carbon offsetting projects. It was kind of a role model for boosting local development and empowering women and youth. Developed by Wildlife Works, and it was approved in 2011 by Verra, which is a standard, and it was certified also for gender equity and socio-economic development. And the buyers are like typical companies from the global north, like Barclays, Microsoft, Shell, and Kering, and up to now 2 million credits were issued so far on this project. So 2 million is a big project. And the risk posed by existing carbon offset projects frequently outweigh their positive benefits. So a lot of projects create misleading narratives of protection of indigenous rights, local development, and women's empowerment. And the reality shows that the do not harm principle is breached in many cases, and that's also a very worrying element. Grievance mechanisms are missing or deficient. And in the case of the Kasigao Corridor REDD+ project, investigation exposed systematic sexual abuse and harassment between 2011 and 23 by senior male employees of Wildlife Works. And there was several broader risks identified: exploitation of local communities, ineffective and biased auditing practices, and additional harms also on indigenous people. And it's a very, it's just one example. I think this project was being covered in many articles detailing the problems related to forest projects. But I think it really also shows that it's just very difficult in these projects to get that right, because you talk to communities which actually do not always have access to project documentation, do not speak the same language, etc. So it's not, these challenges are just very difficult to solve. What we'll see, and this is more now related to Article 6, is that some country, and it's mostly related to 6.2 to be more precise, is that some countries are now trying to turn REDD+ projects, which actually is not part, this REDD+ framework is not part of Article 6 and also not part of the Paris Agreement, but was negotiated earlier. The UN REDD+ framework results from several UN decisions, and that we see that these countries are trying to transition their REDD+ projects into Article 6, although REDD+ and Article 6 framework requirements are very different in terms of quantification, additionality, permanence, safeguards, and double counting. And that actually REDD+ results should not be able to qualify as ITMOs. But, as I said before, the lack of international rules that prevent countries to turn REDD+ into ITMOs, and we saw that Guyana has already authorized the issuance of forestry-based carbon credits. And the mandate of Article 6.2 review team, it checks the documentation, but there is no substantive quality check. The team is actually not authorized or doesn't have the mandate to actually look at whether using the REDD+ framework for Article 6 requirements is a good idea or not, and there is no possibility for the review team to actually block this from happening. So the only way, or the only thing that can come out of this, is the recommendation to mark ITMOs identified as is consistent, not be used. But again, you could still use them towards your NDCs, because there is no international rules being there to prevent this. Now I'm turning to another chapter, which is Article 6 and the VCM, and I just want to summarize recent developments on the VCM markets and what they mean for Article 6. So as I just said, with the examples of REDD+ projects, in recent years, we saw a lot of scandals related to the VCM, but we also saw that some standards and recommendations actually move away from offsetting. This was the case. I mean, SBTi never recognized offsets in accounting of targets. ISO guidelines is also going into that direction, and the HLEC recommendation also basically said you cannot account offsets as emissions reductions. There was also regulation and legal challenges against offsetting claims on the rise, especially in the EU with the Green Claim Directive. And we also see companies publicly moving away from offsetting. But we also see a very worrying element that the VCM market has not transitioned to the new realities of the Paris Agreement. So there is a massive risk of double claiming, because most standards on the voluntary carbon market do not recognize double claiming as being a risk. They say the corporates have a different inventories as countries, and therefore you cannot talk about double claiming. But the result is still that the same emission reduction can be counted twice if a company, an American companies, for instance, invest in a project in Peru and say they are carbon neutral, and Peru say we have fulfilled our targets. The same emission reduction is being counted twice. This is clearly double claiming. We also see that additionality needs a new definition focused on high-hanging fruits. But here again, we don't see the VCM evolving in that direction. VCM focus on forest projects increase risks of low integrity. There is a massive risk of overcrediting and also social risks not being addressed. And of course, it hasn't changed. The market is actually still unregulated, and the reliance on the VCM means higher reputational risks for companies using it. I think we see that there is a growing question around the role of the VCM can play in the instrument mix, and so there is more focus on the mitigation hierarchy, meaning you need to do your homework first before turning into offsets, and also there is a low demand. We have seen attempts to tackle the credibility crisis last year. As Dr. Khalid has said before, there is this ICVCM, the Integrity Concept for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, on the supply side, but this has been developed and supported mostly by private interest, and we still are curious to see how these ICVCM core carbon principles develop, mostly with regards to the CDM project transitioning to 6.4, and on the methodology used in these old CDM projects. There is also a CCQI, so the Carbon Credits Quality Initiative, which was developed by a non-profit research institute and NGOs. And here I invite you to look at the website, because it developed a scoring tool fully available to assess carbon credits quality, where basically you can enter a few criteria on any project and you already have an evaluation of the quality. And then on the demand side, there was the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative being developed, also mostly by private interest, and the VCMI claims code of practice provides guidance on how company can make voluntary use of carbon markets, of carbon credits. If you look at the volumes on the voluntary market, you see that the market totally collapsed after 21 and is actually not recovering from its serious repetition damages. There is still a downward trend since 21, and it seems that the repetition has been damaged for at least the mid-term. And also the prices on the voluntary market is something interesting to look at. Overall, the very low prices are a sign that the use of VCM credits leads to mitigation deterrence, because it is much cheaper for companies to buy VCM credit than to reduce emissions themselves. So most project types generate credits with a price of less than 10 euro. And just as a comparison, prices in the ETS in the EU have been between 70 and 80 euros in 25. So this is a pretty serious compliance scheme. And then the social cost of carbon, I just added this because I liked the introduction of Dr. Khalid at the beginning. The social cost of carbon in Germany is 300 euro, meaning if you generate 1 ton of CO2 in Germany, you actually generate a damage which would cost 300 euros to fix. And in comparison to that, the prices on the voluntary carbon market are just very, very low, and actually way too low to be taken seriously. Now I'll pass it on to my colleague for the last part on case studies.
Exactly. Now we come to the last part, which are some case studies, or we look at some examples. I have to apologize in advance that there won't be too many precise examples for projects you can develop, because there are just yet not many projects under Article 6, because it is very much at the beginning. But we will give you some example of specific project types into which direction it might be good to evolve. And here on this slide, you can see 2 dimensions. As we mentioned earlier, the technology dimension is very important. So projects should be very high demanding and emerging technology. So it should be something very new, something which is not there already. And at the same time, on the other dimension, look at the cost, and it should be of high cost. So on the right bottom side, you can see the potential area for Article 6 projects. And on the top left side, you see the projects which should rather not go into Article 6, but just be implemented in the country by the country itself to use it under their own NDC, and to not sell them under Article 6. Those bottom right side from the graph we just saw, those also are the high-hanging fruits we have mentioned before. And they refer to the ones which are exactly very expensive, so have extraordinary costs, usually around $100 or euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, or even higher, and which have a uncertainty of return from innovative and emerging measures. And there are multiple barriers to such projects. So the most difficult ones you should implement, that is the target. And we've given 3 examples, one from Mongolia, with a district heating and solar assisted ground source heat pump, which are being implemented. So you can see a very advanced technology, which is very expensive. The same with an example in Indonesia, where there has been taking place a electrification of small and medium-sized watercraft. And the example from Georgia with microbiome technologies and perennial grain crops. So also a very specific technology. Then I come to an example from India. Many countries have already put out a positive list. That means a list with recommendations of specific mitigation activity types. So to give kind of a framework for project developers to see in which direction should we go and which type of mitigation activities can actually in the end be transferred under Article 6. And India has an example of a positive list where I've taken out a couple of examples. And this would, for example, be the renewable energy, but only the ones with storage, so that storage energy directly. Then also solar thermal power, or offshore wind. So here you again see the difference. Onshore wind energy is much easier to implement, and in offshore wind energy is much more difficult. Then we have green hydrogen, compressed biogas, or emerging mobility, for example, like fuel cells, and also energy coming from tidal or from the ocean. And other examples were green ammonia and also removal activities, which are usually the most expensive ones. So to remove emissions directly from the air, the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And below I've put the links also to other positive lists from Bhutan and Sri Lanka. So I assume that Pakistan in the future will also develop one of those lists. And there, as we said before, it might be good to go into a discussion in between the government and project developers to see which project types are feasible, which make sense to develop. And the other way around, there can also be a negative list, so a list which excludes specific project types. There is, for example, an example from Switzerland, from a buyer country, which excludes projects they want to buy. So in the end, this is also very important to take care of, because from the demand side, there also might be criteria for specific projects, and to, in the end, ensure quality of the mitigations outcomes which are being transferred. And Switzerland excludes criteria or excludes projects from criteria such as large hydro power plants, very large ones above 20 megawatt, also from projects with biological CO2 sequestration, and the reduction of deforestation and degradation of forests, the REDD mechanism, what we've just talked, or what Juliette has just mentioned before, and biochar. And more general criteria in their exclusion negative list are projects that conflict with environmental or human rights, that have negative social or ecological effects, and that lack adequate local stakeholder consultation. So, of course, those criteria are very broad still, but it shows that it is very important to also look into those aspects. And we also had one question earlier, I think, which asks on those exactly specific causes or topics. And you see that we have to take care of this as well, and that countries are actually already implementing it and putting it into their strategies. Then I have two specific examples of Article 6 strategies from two countries to see what can you expect from countries that have already developed further, that have already their frameworks on Article 6. They might have their own strategies already to see what is coming in the future. And the example is from Ghana, and they have a very specific fee catalog of different revenues they are generating through those transactions of mitigation outcomes. And you see that there are fees just for the participation that are around $200 to $1,000 per activity. And those costs are then used for administrative costs. And then also, as mentioned by Dr. Khalid earlier, that Pakistan also has a corresponding adjustment fee that it is implementing. And for Pakistan, it was, I think, a percentage of 12%, but Ghana, in its example, is using a specific amount of dollars per ITMO, and depending on the project, Ghana is using an amount of $3 to $5 per single ITMO that is being transferred to put on top of the project or the ITMO price, the emissions reduction price, that are then being used by the government in Ghana for a mitigation ambition fund to finance additional activities. So that is what we said earlier, to increase ambition. We do need to see those type of extra payments that in the end increase ambition and provide funds for further projects in the countries. And the last fee they're also having is a listing fee, but that one is rather small, and also for the administrative costs. And last, I have the example of Chile. They have already set a lot of or a big part of their strategy into law, and have built this regulatory framework and have different articles. And under this article, or under this framework, they specify already very much what the country needs to do, and how everything needs to build up to have a good framework that Article 6 can work in a country. And there are, for example, implementation criteria such as the prohibition of double counting, environmental integrity, rights to minorities, additionality, and transparency. So all those very important key points we heard during the presentation are there put into law, that mitigation outcomes need to fulfill those criteria. And those can then work as safeguards that Article 6 will work well in the end. And those frameworks are also then defining specific roles in the government. So which ministries are doing what, and usually that the environmental ministry is having a couple of tasks it needs to be doing, and that there is a national committee who is creating the positive list I've just shown. And under those frameworks, then will also be usually the process of creating ITMOs. So regulating everything around authorization, recognition, validation, registration. So just building up a framework that Article 6 can work well, and in the end also lead to an increase in ambition, and to have that what we're looking for. So that is it for now. Thank you very much for the attendance of and looking or hearing us on this very also difficult topic, very complex topic, I think, especially if you're not too deep into the issue. But I hope you found it interesting, you learned something, and we're very open to hear any questions.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Joshua and Juliet. That has been, again, such a wonderful and informative session. I mean, that's one of the most comprehensive sessions we actually have had on around the Article 6 of the Paris Agreements. Thank you so much. And we participants have a lot of questions. So let me just kind of request everyone to please, we'll shortly be requesting you if you have any particular projects that you think are again, potential projects for being traded under the carbon markets to put down. You can either raise your hands and we're more than happy to listen it directly from you, or feel free to paste them in the chat box or wherever you join from. Either if you're at the LinkedIn Live, you can post them in the comments, or in the YouTube, you can also paste them in the comment section as well. But just in the meanwhile, Joshua and Juliet, just picking up these two questions because being kind of constantly being repeated. One is how do these small scale projects, it could be either small scale decentralized solar projects or very small scale forestry initiatives. What would you propose would be the pathways for these projects to kind of come under these carbon markets or Article 6 arrangement? And particularly two projects that have been mentioned is that if I'm kind of thinking of initiating them, taking an initiative around the mini and microgrid, is that something that can eventually come under carbon markets? Because aren't the buyers looking for any particular minimum quantum of the credits that can be generated? So perhaps this is one of the first question. And the second question, which we're also seeing that is very relevant to this one, perhaps not directly, but there is a lot of question that is coming on around how small and medium enterprises, how SMEs and these startups, what role do they have in these carbon markets or direct Article 6 engagement? So if you can touch upon this point as well. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I think on the first question, how to tackle small scale projects, indeed, that was always a question also already on the CDM, that it's just very difficult because the administrative hurdle is so high to develop small scale activities, and especially if you have to pay for these fees that we saw a few examples on. So I think what exists, and it already existed at the end of the CDM, is a program of activities. So I think you could just pool different activities or similar activities on the RUN program, which limits or restricts the administrative hurdle for single participants. So I think this is something, as I said, there is no methodologies approved on the 6.4, but this is definitely something I would look at if I was interested in these small scale projects. On the second question, participation of SMEs, yeah, I think again you could find a mechanism to pool the money or to pool the emissions reductions and to offer them together on the market. So I think this is also something that could be interesting, looking at different methodology when they are published. But I think this existed at the end of the CDM, but the market crashed in 2011. So it was just very difficult to further implement these projects. But I'm pretty sure that this is something we will see under 6.4. Because this is exactly the kind of project that the UNFCCC wants to have.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. Now, coming to a few of the projects that have been mentioned, I'll just highlight two that are raised over here. How can a cement decarbonization project, such as one implementing LC3 technology, access any of the carbon market incentives to support its implementation and scale up? And the second one that we have actually received is around the biomass industrial project, which states that we're thinking of installing a biomass boiler to kind of within our different industrial units. What is the potential of generating finance for this project? So yeah.
I have to say I don't know. I think this is just a very specific question. I haven't looked into this. I don't know if you've done a research on this, but I'm pretty sure that on each kind of project type there are already advanced studies, maybe not tailored for Pakistan, so you would probably have to look. But I think this is the kind of thing that should be done before going into Article 6.4 is to look at the potential. So, but this is just very specific to the activity and to the country, and I
Agreed.
just don't
Yeah,
know the answer.
Agree. Sure. Next is what is the compliance process for a renewable energy project to qualify under Article 6.2 versus 6.4 mechanism? And if you think any of the particular pathway is more investor friendly?
Yeah. I mean, investor friendly is 6.4 and 6.2 is actually not investor friendly because 6.2 is really between two countries agreeing on one type of emission reduction being transferred. So the private sector cannot really play a role in 6.2 and which will have a big role in 6.4. And I would recommend always going through 6.4 just because as we showed, there is just no rules on the 6.2 to ensure quality. On renewable, I think the question of renewable energy is a very interesting and important one. This was also a big share of CDM credits being generated, but it's also the type of project that is mostly questionable in terms of additionality, just because these projects, once implemented, generate revenues themselves, and then it's always very questionable whether they need or whether they have to rely on additional revenues from the carbon markets to exist. So that is why in a lot of countries like China, I think, has done the most, the biggest share of biggest renewable energy projects under the CDM, but these projects were clearly not additional. And I think 6.4 will not repeat the mistakes of the CDM. And as Joshua showed the positive list of India, it was just very specific. It said renewable energy, but it said offshore energy, or it said renewable energy with storage. So I think these kind of things are interesting because they are more expensive and would probably need some support through revenues by carbon credits. But you really have to be very, very specific when developing renewable energy to ensure that the additionality threshold is met, which is challenging.
Thank you so much. That was very well captured. So, Ms. Sophia, if you have any particular point to add.
Yes, thank you very much. Juliet and Joshua, thank you. That was brilliant. We have some colleagues here from the State Bank, the Central Bank of Pakistan as well, and we focus a lot on the international setting. And in a manner of speaking, the private sector, when they develop projects, has the government almost acting like their marketing agent for them, taking their projects to the international markets and then getting the carbon credits. I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of understanding. Now, when we look at the domestic landscape, what advice would you have for a central bank or other? We have some commercial bank colleagues with us as well, also for commercial banks in the country, in how to help with this sort of transition and unlocking some transition finance. Could you speak to that, please?
So you mean transition finance without, you're not talking about carbon markets, or you mean transition finance through the carbon markets?
I mean transition finance via the carbon markets, but not necessarily, just looking at the international level, but also as a way to unlock domestic climate finance.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I mean, I would start with a mapping of potential buyers and would map them according to their interest into integrity. I think we have different buyers on the market who are interested at very, very different levels of integrity. And then I said before, the EU, because it is being analyzed and criticized a lot, will do Article 6, but has to deliver on integrity. Just because the last experience with the CDM was so catastrophic that it wants to avoid this being again the case. And I think I would just do a mapping of buyers and would only address potential buyers interested in integrity. So I think it's the EU, I think Switzerland, countries like this are interested in integrity because they are under massive critique domestically to actually rely on Article 6. And then I would go and talk to them and negotiate on a bilateral basis all the things that we just said. I would only offer high-end fruits on the market. I would ensure that high fees are applied, so you can create revenues, additional revenues within the countries. And I would also ensure that at least 30% of the mitigation outcomes being generated through the project stay within the country. And if you add all these conditions, you come up with ITMOs that are very expensive, and you need to explain this. And I think, at least for a European audience, it's quite easy to understand just because we had this experience before. And probably with other audience, it's difficult, and that's why I would just specialize myself into the audience that are interested in integrity and ready to pay the price.
Sure, perfect. That sounds really good. Let me just ask if Dr. Khalid or Zainab has anything particularly further to add to the discussion before we move towards the final concluding. Yes, Dr. Khalid, if you have anything.
Yes, well, just one thing. I think the role of regulator would be very important in this regard because they just not have to regulate the market. A financial regulation would be required. As carbon markets are emerging, the need for high quality, high integrity carbon credits is increasing day by day. So we need to agree on the definition of high quality or high integrity. If that integration is achieved, I think Pakistan would have a good functional, equitable, operational carbon market. But if it doesn't, I think there would be inefficiencies. And this time, we have seen lots and lots of inefficiencies in Pakistan's regulated markets. But this time around, it would be related to equality, integrity. So we need to focus on that as well. So generating high quality, high integrity carbon credits, it would require a very active sort of regulator that is MOCC, and it should work on two parallel things. First, developing market efficiencies. Second, how to make it in a way that is more inclusive and more equitable, particularly from a standpoint that we have a federal Ministry of Climate Change, and we have certain departments that have been devolved to provincial governments as well. So yeah, back to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid. Zainab, do you have any last points that you want to make? And just before coming after Zainab, will be requested.
I think we have covered. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have covered everything so far. No points from my end. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Zainab. Before going to Ms. Sobhi, if I can request all of the participants, for those who are comfortable, if they can kindly turn on their video feeds for just a minute. I will just take a couple of screenshots of the people. That would be really great. So if I can request the MIS team to just take a couple of shots of people who have their video feeds on.
But
Thank
do
you.
we
I
need to
believe
say
I believe
cheese?
that was I believe the MIS team has captured a bit. I will definitely forward those to you as well. So with this, let me come to Ms. Sobia for final concluding and reflections on the session, and then we'll move to final thanks. Yes, thank you so much. Over to you, Ms. Sobia.
Thank you so much. I think I have the toughest job after such a great session with inputs from Khalid, Zainab, Juliet, and Joshua. My heartfelt thanks to everyone for the effort and also to all the fabulous participants. It was a rich and a very long session, so thank you for staying the course with us. We learned, and I'm just going to now go through some points that I jotted down. It's very important for project developers in Pakistan to be very familiar with the broader policy debates around Articles 6.2 and 6.4, but more so with Article 6.4 for the different reasons that we've elaborated. And that's why becoming familiar or familiarizing yourself with the key terminologies, as well as understanding what the Paris Agreement credit mechanism is going to be very important, because that's how you can better design your projects, which are going to find traction in international markets. What is also key, and my takeaway, is that it is important for the private sector, the project developers, to be very closely involved in the development of the domestic landscape, as well as in the development of any parameters and guidelines for PACM implementation, because you do want to have your voice in these policy setting processes. What we have seen is that there are positive lists, there are negative lists. As Juliet was saying, it's also important to have a listing of or to have a stock take of potential buyers, and then go from there. So this is an essential starting point. As we saw from the REDD+ example from Kenya, and also from Switzerland's negative list, it's very important to be very cognizant of social and environmental safeguards, because if there are any risks related to quality, integrity, or human rights related aspects, then this is a risk which is very difficult to overcome if, unfortunately, a project is somehow affected by that. Within the PACM, we've seen that Pakistan will be participating in that. And what is also a key takeaway is also to develop projects which New Climate Institute refers to as the high-hanging fruits. So these are not necessarily the carbon credits that are generated at cheaper prices and so, but these are really the higher end of the spectrum, which also makes it profitable and fruitful to go to the international markets with. And then finally, there is a great deal of internal process setting and safeguard setting to be that needs to be developed further. This includes the role of regulators. It includes there's certainly a role for the central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, to be involved, and there is certainly a role or a closer examination is also needed from a green taxonomy related approach of how this can better be integrated together, so that we can come full circle, unlocking finance for the type of projects that are being developed, and also for the technology needs that are going to be coming up in future as well. With that, I think that I have given a very brief roundup of the main points that were discussed. Please do stay in touch, because this is going to be the first of more webinars that we're going to be, and teach-ins that we're going to be organizing in future as well. My thanks to the participants and the presenters and our knowledge partners, the New Climate Institute, as well as the SDPI. With that, back to you, Ved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Suvia, for very concisely summarizing all the key discussion points that we have had today. Yes, and thank you so much. Perfect, Juliet, Joshua, Dr. Khalid, Zainab. That was really insightful presentations, really had to learn a lot. And just like I mentioned at the very start, this was the most comprehensive discussion that we actually had on Article 6, particularly various subcomponents. So thank you so much, everyone, for your very insightful participation. And just towards the ending, we just have a 3.5 minute vote of thanks from the Executive Director of SDPI, Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri. So I'll request the MIS team to kindly play that recorded message, and with that message, we'll say goodbye to everyone. So Hamza, if you can kindly play the recording.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was a real pleasure, and I'm sure you must be feeling as educated as I am after listening to our distinguished guests from New Climate Initiative, from my own colleagues from SDPI, and especially from Sobia Baker and Mr. Hesse, Wolfgang Hesse. Today's event, it was to discuss Article 6 and carbon market pathways for the private sector. I won't go into the whole detail and summarizing what the distinguished panel has already said, but I must re-emphasize the importance of carbon markets and importance of understanding Article 6, especially in the new trade regime and in the new trade era. Now it is commonly believed that carbon markets and carbon trading, it's not only about climate change, which of course we know is extremely important and extremely crucial and critical for the countries like Pakistan. One can see the vagaries of climate change, and it's not only confined to developing countries, even the developed world, including United States of America. We have just seen what happened in Texas last week. So whole of the world is getting affected from climate change. But if it is not enough to give a jerk to change our rules of business, rules of doing business, and rules of game, then the understanding that this Article 6 and carbon market and carbon trade and emission trading schemes, they will be impacting our livelihoods, and they would be impacting the way we do trade and business and the way private sector operate. That is still another dimension of importance of this. While we are now gearing up for Belém, for COP30, where many of these things would be discussed, and the nitty-gritty and details of many of these issues will be discussed threadbare. I think it is quite important that our private sector is also informed about all these development. Private sector has taken lead on many initiatives in the past, and I'm quite confident that this is an area which would be very ably led by private sector, and the private sector leaders and industry would try to find opportunities and to avail them in this whole new regime, in this whole tariff regime, and navigating and sailing their way through this carbon related tariff regime in the future. I thank you again for the distinguished panelists and for all those who spared their time to join us remotely, and we look forward to interact with you in the future too. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you so much, everyone. Just in responding to the question from everyone, as for the recording link, that is already available on both the YouTube as well as LinkedIn. We'll definitely send you. As for the presentations, we'll just take a contact from the colleagues from the Neo Climate Institute and the STPI team, and we'll see which documents we can actually send those over to you. So with this, Ms. Sophia, do you have anything, or we can perhaps conclude? Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
just to say thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
everyone.
much,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.